We are in Champions League, man.
That was my next
Dilly din, dilly dong, come on.
Ancora Messi, 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 gol, 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 gol.
Into Sheringham, and Solskjaer has won it!
I will love it if we beat them. Love it.
This is the Modern Soccer Coach Podcast with Gary Curneen.
Aguero!
Hello, welcome to the Modern Soccer Coach Podcast. My name is Gary Curneen. Joining me for this episode is David Garcia. David is the Director of Coaching for Colorado Rapids, U9 through to U12. Originally from New York, he spent a little bit of time in Spain, worked in Tovo Academy with Todd Bean, UEFA A licensed, really unique journey, does a lot of great stuff on social media as well. Really passionate about the way the game should be played. So I want to get him on and talk about positional play and a possession-based system at the youth level, how to implement it from day one, especially with pre-season coming up. So really interested to get your thoughts on this as coaches. At Gary Curneen on Instagram, at Gary Curneen on Twitter. Really appreciate the support. Here is David. Enjoy.
David, thanks so much for joining me today on the Modern Soccer Coach Podcast. Really excited to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Gary. Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm a listener myself, so I'm excited to be here.
The topic that I wanted to go in was implementing a positional play possession model at the youth level. I know we have a lot of youth coaches that listen. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we get into these conversations and in the elite side of the game that's probably more directed towards senior soccer and college soccer. But a lot of the values and principles apply to youth level. So I want to try and connect the dots in some of these here. So particularly with pre-season starting soon and youth coaches, as a massive proponent of that style of the game, a positional play and a possession system, what should pre-season at the youth level look like? What should it not look like?
I guess the first question for you is what are we considering youth? Because I think at certain age groups, there's things that you need to focus on, and past a certain age group, I think you can focus on other things. For example, I think towards the older age groups, working on the training loads and making sure that they are, ready for the season as far as physically. I think that's important to consider. However, I think for the younger, could be from U9 to maybe U13, U14, where I think that isn't so much the case. I think that sort of dictates also what kind of preseason you're looking at.
So let's just randomly call out U9 level, and right. You have them, say you've got them coming back on their last couple of weeks of their vacation, so you've got a little mini preseason camp, maybe 5 nights training, and then they'll kick into maybe a preseason tournament where they go somewhere, and then maybe 2-3 nights a week training. Yeah. So what do you think that should look like?
I think, honestly, especially at those younger ages, the most important thing is creating good training habits. It's creating players who come to practice, and when you start practice, they can be focused for the time that you are in practice and training. I think that's not an easy thing to do, especially at the younger age groups, because, cognitively, they don't have the attention span of some of those older age groups, and that's something that they need to work on, just like any other skill that they need to practice on the field. And is can they stay engaged and stay focused? And I think that goes, right into the positional play. Is there's the cognitive side and the mental side of positional play requires a lot of thinking. Therefore, you can't have players checking out in the middle of a game, or you're gonna see, the structure might not be the one that you want. So I think the most important thing with the younger age groups is making sure that the practices that you start the season with and how those are run and what the coach brings to those practices and sort of setting the tone for what is expected and what is allowed in practice. Obviously, we still want them to have fun. So I'm not saying you go in there like a drill sergeant, right? But you do have certain levels of respect for the training environment, and they should learn that from the beginning. I think that's really important to start the preseason with. Additionally, I think teaching younger players how to be competitive and how to win, how to lose, how to fight for in a game, and to, you know, all the things that we talk about that sport can bring, can give players, is learning how to compete. And I think that's, especially later on, if they have good competitive nature, that they understand that when they work hard and focus and are engaged throughout the practice, that tends to lead to positive results. Obviously, at that age group, the results aren't as important, but as they continue growing, and they'll see that those things correlate. So, like I said, creating good habits and setting the tone for the season, I think, is absolutely crucial, especially at that age group.
Yeah, this is interesting, because I would have said that, well, from your work and your journey, you would have said that, you know, there was be certain principles, and as well as do we overlook the fact that intensity in training and competition are still vital components of a training system, and try to look for the bit of gold in the tactical analysis piece a little bit too early, do you think?
In my opinion, you can't have the other things without having good training habits, and you can't go into, for example, and I know we'll probably talk about this later on, but in rondos, you know, surely you've noticed when you give that type of exercise to a younger age group, they don't quite see how it is competitive and how it can be. And if the defender or two defenders inside the rondo aren't trying to win the ball back, then there's nothing that we can do as far as our attacking principles, because the defenders aren't playing in a game realistic way. So I think the starting point is making sure that young players are learning how to compete in the game, and sort of we're instilling that drive in them to want the ball and to do everything they can to get the ball, because later on that will make practices much easier. I'm sure you've seen practices where the group is, you know, maybe they're a bit slow or a bit down, and the coach is the one that has to bring the energy to practice, and I think from time to time that will happen. However, if they have that competitive drive to want to win every single activity and every single exercise that you put in front of them, that will make practices and getting what you want out of the practices and training much easier later on. So I think, for me, yes, obviously, we need to start working on, for example, perception when they're younger and making sure that they're looking for space. I think that's the most important thing when they are younger. However, without that competitive nature, training is much more difficult. And I think for the players and for the coach.
I like that, because what you're saying there is basically, you know, for the Rondo was a fantastic teaching tool. This is one of my questions, but sometimes it can be too easy, too mundane. I mean, I've watched youth training sessions where I actually would rather them run around a field where it looks as if they're actually doing something by standing in a box passing. So that's one of the ways then of building your culture, building your environment to actually, because we do have to teach that now, don't we? We do have to teach competition at youth levels.
I think so. I've worked with enough young players to see that the ones that typically tend to excel later on are the ones that are most competitive, and I don't think it's a coincidence that that's the case. And I think just like any other skill, that is something that can be learned. And I think with the right training environment and with the right energy from the coach when they're younger, they can, hopefully we can bring out that competitive nature. And like I said, and like you just said, when you have competitive players, any exercise you give them, whether it's a rondo, whether it's a 3v3, whether it's a 1v1, whether they're playing some sort of positional game, it makes it so much more fun, so much easier to get coaching points out when everybody's competing to their maximum level, and they want to win and they want to succeed. And I think, that's I know we were going to talk about rondos, but I think it's hard, and it can be mundane if players don't want to excel in every exercise, and especially in rondos. So that competitive nature from early on, creating that culture I think it's crucial. It's crucial.
A barrier perhaps to coaching a positional play system or a possession system that I would believe that you definitely get this online. I've heard this from quite a number of coaches who are resistant to implementing it really early on is, we can't move into the possession system until our players can master the basics. So we're going to spend 8 weeks passing the ball back and forth. But obviously then they overlook context, game understanding, any form of decision-making variables, etc., etc. What are the ways that they can do both? How can a young coach at the U10, U12, whatever level, get them into a possession system and master the basics and look into decision-making and context, etc.?
So my first question would be, how do we define basics, right? Because I think basics, as I've come to understand, is how people have defined it to me, is being able to pass or dribble the ball without any opposition. However, I don't think we need to take away opposition in order to master the basics. I think you can still have an element of decision making. You can have more time and space. You can create activities that give them more time and space. So yes, maybe there's still an opposition, but maybe it's in a larger space where they have more time to be able to process what they want to achieve in that exercise. So for example, let's take a passing game, and for example, we'll do one I do with our younger groups to focus on passing, and in my opinion gets the basics as well as the cognitive side, as well as decision making. It's basically you have two sides, two areas, and you have a 4v4, and the coach plays into one of the teams on one side of the groups into a group of 4, and the other team has to send, let's just say, to start one player. They have to send one player, and that player has to go try to win the ball and then pass it back to the team. Very common game, right? In that exercise, we're still working on the basics. If a player is struggling with how they pass the ball, then a simple in the game pointer to them, or even take a minute or two between reps of the exercise and just make sure that everybody understands that we're trying to use the inside of our foot to pass the ball. We're trying to make sure that our plant foot is next to the ball. So you give them the basics, and you still give them some form of opposition decision making. They still have to be aware of where the defender is. You can make it bigger, which will give them more time to execute the pass and to receive a ball. And from there, you build on how they're progressing in not only the technical side of it, but also the perceptual side and the decision making and everything, and you can make the spaces tighter when you start to see this way too easy for them. And I think that is how you can do, and you can do that with dribbling, you can do that with finishing, you can do it with anything. Still make it game-like, but give them more time, which by giving them more space. That's my approach to it, and I know it is an ongoing debate. I have, especially for really beginner players who perhaps you have one player who is not as far along as the rest of the group. Yeah, perhaps you have to take them aside and give them unopposed repetitions of a certain exercise or a certain skill. That I think is okay, because as a group, maybe they're further along than that one player, so you have to help them close the gap, because otherwise, we've all seen it where it can bring an exercise down, or perhaps even knock the confidence of that one player. So I think in that circumstance it's absolutely fine. But however, when as a group everyone is along the same development, I think there's nothing wrong with opposed training that is specific to a technical skill.
Yeah, on the same lines then, with trying to challenge the players tactically, and for a coach to have in their heads the why of every exercise and how it relates to the game. The young player has not possibly developed a soccer brain or soccer IQ at that stage to see those pictures or have experience of those pictures. So how does a coach then paint those pictures or educate players tactically without standing lecturing or confusing them?
I'd say, my approach is when you understand the game of football from its principles, and the most basic thing, I guess, that I always start with younger players is the most important thing we're trying to look for on the field is space, right? So how can we build on that, on the idea of finding space? So for the youngest player just starting out, you just say, if you're in space, if you're dribbling in space, keep dribbling in space. When a defender comes towards you, then you find a teammate who is now in space. That's the first concept that we can teach them: space, finding space. And this requires not only being able to move the ball and being able to dribble past, but it also requires them to be able to do that all with their head up and to be aware of what's going on. So to me, starting the building blocks tactically, then you move on from there, and say there's different ways of finding space. So as you grow, as they develop and they get older, maybe you start talking about a third player who isn't involved in the play, but perhaps can get into space within a pass or two. So, the concept of a third man. So having them recognize themselves as a player who's not involved in the play at the moment. However, if our center mid finds or is able to get the ball from our center back and then play it into myself or this third man, then that's another concept, but it's the same thing. It's still working on finding space. And I think you just keep building on from there. But I think what's most important is understanding what's the root principle that we're starting from. And from there, I think every coach can sort of logically get to the tactics that we see at the highest level and how they still apply and how that same principle of space still applies at that level.
Basically, at the young level, it may be dribbling towards more space, but as that progresses then to U14, U15, U16, the solution might be a manipulation of numbers in a certain area or a tactical construct in their own system.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
as the level improves, the number of solutions should become a little bit more complex.
Exactly. And I think as the level improves, what the opponent is doing to prevent you from finding space is also improving. Therefore, we have to do other things to try to find that space. And like you said, maybe that is an overload on one side of the pitch and try to find our free man on the other side of the pitch. Or perhaps it's as simple as, just positioning yourselves between lines. That's another way to find space. Perhaps it's even making a run so that you don't get the ball, but your teammate gets the ball. And I think those are all concepts that at the end of the day are ways to find space. And whether you create it or you're the one exploiting it, that is, as a collective, as a team, we're trying to do that. And ideally we try to do that in the final third, which then, leads into good scoring opportunities. So yeah, as you've summed it up, I think that's it, the way that I see it, and how you can teach that is, first of all, you have to understand what your players are capable of and where they are along that. If you see that they easily understand that dribble into space, and then I'm no longer in space because the defender stepped up to me. I brought a defender in, so now one of my teammates is in space. Then that's easy. Then we start moving on, and I think the important thing is that you understand where they are on their tactical understanding and what you can give them next.
Reading one of your tweets, you said learning requires experimentation, freedom, space, errors, reflection, willingness, setbacks. Are your players learning? I wanted to ask you, what are some ways that we can present things like the setbacks and errors in our environment without promoting a negative message to our players?
Sure. I think by nature, the game, obviously, there's going to be a winner and a loser. And I think that alone, and I think this all goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, is that competitive nature. The game will provide, and I think we can all agree that the greatest setback is losing a match or losing something, right? And I think how they deal with that and possibly creating an environment where there is a chance that they aren't going to succeed, and that's not something that's malevolent on our part, but that's the nature of the game, is that someone is going to win or lose. At times you're going to succeed in whatever, beating the player in front of you in a 1v1, or perhaps defensively you've got beat, so now that is sort of a setback. I think all those little battles within a big game I consider them as setbacks. And when they start piling up and we have several errors and several setbacks, then that leads to losing whatever it is you're playing, whether it's the game or whether it's an activity or some sort of training game. And I think teaching players how to respond after that, and maybe I phrased that wrong, not teaching players, having them learn how to respond after that. And we do that by, I see it a lot with younger players. They don't know how to react to losing, and they have to try to internalize it as a positive thing, there's another opportunity. And I remember I had a coach that I worked with in Spain, and he would say football is like waves, and you get wave after wave, waves being the opportunities that you can try yourself and try to improve. You get wave after wave of opportunities, so you just have to wait for the next wave, and when it does come, you get back on and you do your best with it. So I think having them learn how to respond after whatever setback they face, and like I said before, could be something within the game, is how they're going to start to internalize that feeling of losing, of not doing your best. And are they going to respond by trying it again, or are they going to shut down and go inside and not want to try again? So I think that's our place to guide them along. But, and like I said, I don't like the word teach, because that implies that I know how to do it and I'm just telling them how to do it. I'd rather use for them to learn how to do that and how to respond from those setbacks. I think that's the approach I use, and whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but I think that's a good way to go about it.
Coaches who are looking to play, this is another one. I've spoken to quite a few youth coaches who have dealt with this here, want to play a possessional game, but there's parents on the sideline who are not only yelling about results, but now they're yelling about little Johnny or little Susie to launch it and kick it long, and it seems to be a problem nationwide here. What are some ways coaches can work around this?
All right. Yeah, I think it is, like you said, it is a problem. And I think that comes with educating parents as well. Because perhaps, and I don't think, I know parents aren't doing it to be the bad guy, right? They genuinely think that is the best way to go about it. Otherwise, they wouldn't say it. They want what's best for their son or daughter, which means what's best for their team. So I think the first step is having an education for parents, whether that's a formal education and you have meetings, you have a parent meeting maybe once a month, and you talk about, you show them the game model that you're using, whether your club's using it or your team using it, and say, we're trying to play this way, and there's going to be tons of questions, and I know that because I've done it, and there's going to be some confusion and there's going to be some disagreement, but you said, we believe as a club or as a team or whatever it is, that this is the best way, and this is the way that your children are going to learn the most. And from there, you slowly start to in a sense make them an assistant coach of yours, because at the end of the day, the contact time that you have with the players is a lot less than the contact time that the parent has with their son or daughter. And if you are saying one thing at practice and then they get in the car and they're telling their son or daughter something completely different, one, it's very confusing for the player, and two, it's going to result in the player not knowing what to do. And so I think having those conversations with parents and educating them is probably, in my opinion, the first step. From there, in my experience, I have had some parents who have disagreed with the way that the club is going about the game model and style of play, whatever. And in those cases, there's, in my opinion, there's only a certain point that you can try to convince someone or try to bring someone on the same side. And if it comes to that, you say, this is the model that we're gambling on, we're betting on, and we believe that it's a good philosophy for them to understand the game at the highest level. If that's not something that you are interested in, perhaps this isn't the place for your son or daughter. And I think those are the most difficult conversations. But at the end of the day, I think in the long run, that player will benefit if the parent is on board with whatever is done. So whether maybe that's not on our team or in our club, but that, in my opinion, that's me looking out for that player, because those parents need to be on board with what we're doing.
Getting them on board is
Yeah.
a big, it's a big part of the challenge as well. I had one of the local coaches here, Teddy, who coaches at Chicago Empire, is working towards a similar model of, a real expansive, attractive brand of soccer with his youth teams. I was asking him before, I was texting him, telling him I was going to speak to you, what questions does he have for you? He said, how do you balance and teach adaptability and flexibility when implementing positional play with your teams?
I think we go back to the first part, is the principles, right? So the principle, again, and I think positional play is all on space, and how do we manage space? How do we manage individually, and how do we manage it as a team? Perhaps in certain games or certain scenarios, the opposition is forcing us into uncomfortable situations, which maybe requires not having possession. And perhaps that means maybe playing more counterattack. And that, if we go back to the original principle, space, well, in that case, the space we've recognized is in behind, rather than us trying to manage the game or to manage the space in their half, or trying to get it away from our goal. So I think if you're trying to make sure that the players can be adaptable and flexible in the style of play, you have to make sure that they understand why we're doing certain things, or why the team is doing certain things, with the starting point being the principle, right? And from there, if a different scenario comes up, you can always say, okay, normally we do this. However, in this case, X, Y, and Z is happening, so we can't do this now. Let's go back to what we always try to do, and we try to find the space. Where's the space now? And hopefully, if those ideas and concepts are instilled deep enough and they internalize them, then that flexibility, they'll start to have that mental flexibility to say, okay, well, it's in behind, or maybe whatever the scenario is. And I think, that's the way that I've always approached it, is having players who hopefully are understanding the principles, and from there their game intelligence increases, because now I think that, in my opinion, that's the true measure of intelligence is, well, if I have to dictate what is done, the coach, I mean, then I don't think our players are intelligent. If they're able to recognize scenarios and adapt, I think that is the measure of true intelligence, is understanding and recognizing this scenario requires this solution.
Last two for you, and really coming off your personal journey then, and you have a very unique journey in your coaching career, because I've had so many coaches on here that have kind of done the other way around, that have come from Europe to the United States and brought something. You've gone the other way, gone from the US and spent time in Spain and getting your UEFA A over there as well. And I was keen to ask you, how have you grown as a coach, and what did that experience, how did that change you or mold you?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think I'm probably not done learning or being molded, as you phrased it. But yeah, I guess growing up in the U.S., I think I had a lot of probably traditional coaches. I grew up in upstate New York and played in in Rochester, New York, if people are familiar with that area. Growing up, that was the football that I went to go see, and watching. I remember I have this book, and I just found it recently. All the signatures from those old '90s Rhinos players. So yeah, that was sort of the area that I grew up in, and it's not like it wasn't a big football area, a big soccer area. So, the coaches that we had, I think, did the best that they could. I don't fault them at all. And I think a lot of times those coaches do what their coaches did, and those coaches do what their coaches did. So that sort of lineage as far as coaching doesn't ever really change. So, my background growing up wasn't the greatest training environment, coaching environment. However, my father obviously was one of my coaches growing up, and he decided to go off to Spain, and he met these Spanish guys, and they started doing these summer camps in Rochester, New York, and when I met these guys, it was almost like somebody pulled back the curtains on something I hadn't ever thought about, because at that time I was just starting coaching. I was a graduate assistant at a university in upstate New York. I was coaching youth, and then when these guys came in, these Spanish coaches, I was like, I'm missing something. It was one of those moments where you're like, there's way more, and I need to find out more. So over the course of some months and years, I ended up over there, and quite honestly, it's one of those things where you think back on the sessions that I used to do and sort of my thinking, and it's hard to do like a before and after, because obviously I'm the same person, so it's difficult to do, but I have found old practices that I used to do, and I wouldn't ever do them now. And I think it's that philosophy of I think in Spain, they in their culture and also in their football, everything is connected, right? So everything has a consequence. To every action has a consequence. And in football, the same thing is, you can't train isolated parts and then put it all together and have it be the game. And I think that's how they train, and that's sort of what I saw in doing the UEFA courses, and then also when I got in contact with Todd Bean, and then doing working for Tovo for a year. It was the same philosophy from the moment that I arrived in Spain, because I also played in Spain for a year or two when I first arrived, and I was younger. And that sort of same philosophy is carried through. And perhaps it's just the way that you create habits, right? And my habit of how I coached started to be that. And because I was seeing it everywhere, and I started to use it, and selfishly, I enjoyed coaching that way more, because I thought it was more personal, the way that they coached and the way that they approached training. So now coming back, I think sometimes I forget that the players that I have now here in the US haven't done sort of some of these activities and some of these exercises, and what I'm asking them to do and to think and they're uncomfortable with. And I'll be honest, sometimes I get a little bit frustrated, but it's part of the learning process for them and for me. And then now that I am back, I'm hoping to help. And I'm not saying that the way that I learned out in Spain is the only way or the best way or whatever it is. It's a way that I enjoy, and my goal is to, maybe there's somebody else like me who will find this methodology entertaining and interacting with in this way to be to be a better way and in a more enjoyable way to coach.
Yeah, that's my last one for you. Funny, just to wrap it up and move in that direction would be, you've spent 2 years over there or longer, and you've had full time. You've done your coach education over there. You've played over there. You've worked in full time soccer over there. So for the coach, that type of soccer has so many thousands of coaches over here gravitate towards or are intrigued and love the Spanish methodology and the style of soccer, but maybe aren't in a position to take those, take 2 or 3 years, move the whole family over there. What's the best way for them to learn, experience it? Is it through club trips? Is it just to take weeks over by themselves? Is there courses over there? What would you advise those coaches to do?
Yeah, obviously I was fortunate enough to be at a stage in my life where I could just get up and leave, but I completely understand that that's not the case for probably most people. So I think, just like I think in life as well, I think just traveling and seeing firsthand what the culture, and this could be football culture as well, seeing firsthand makes a huge impact. And I don't think it needs to be years and years and doing I think just a holiday or vacation in a country that you enjoy, and maybe even what I found is when you reach out to people when you're traveling, especially I think in the community of football, people tend to respond well, and they respond positively, and they'll invite you to come to practice, and they'll have a chat with you, and I think that's I think that's the beauty of the sport, is it brings us all together, but two, there's a big learning opportunity there. So I think that's probably my suggestion for people, is it doesn't have to be years and years. It can be, a week in whatever country, and there's tons of I know there's tons of courses that are offered in well, I know in Spain, just from firsthand experience, but I'm sure in other countries as well, where you go and you do your courses, and it's sort of tourism with football, and honestly, is there anything better than that? So I think just reaching out, or quick Google search of some courses, and obviously I can help out in whatever way I can. People can reach out to me, and I'll give my recommendations for the courses that I've seen in Spain that aren't 2 years, or maybe it's just a week course, and I'll help out in whatever way I can as well. But I think my suggestion is go to these places that you want to go to, and reach out to people, an email, a phone call, and I guarantee that someone will respond positively, and they'll hopefully you can connect with people abroad.
Brilliant. David, thank you so much. Great way to finish it. We did a little bit of a promotion last week for the event in Texas coming up, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of coaches excited to see you present there and hopefully connect with you. But appreciate all the work you do in the coaching community, and was brilliant to have you on the show.
No, thanks for having me, Gary. It's it's always a pleasure. Well, obviously, like I said, I'm a listener as well, so
Brilliant.
So yeah.
Thanks so much to David for his time and his insight there. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Really insightful for me, really interesting for me, because, like I said at the start, I don't work in youth soccer. I don't work in that area. But really, really fascinated by just how the tacticalization, if that's even a word, of football and coaching has impacted the young age group. And I think to a detriment a lot of times. And as I said to David there at the start, I go to some places, I will observe sessions, I see stuff online, and I look at it and think, If I was a young player, I wouldn't enjoy that. Yes, that's a tactical, does this, is it game realistic in terms of working with the 9 and the 7, the 11 and the 10, and etc., etc. Yes, it ticks that box. Does it engage? Does it fuel a passion for learning? Does it fuel an enjoyment of the game for young players? Absolutely not. And I really thought that was a great point by David, who is, if you look at his social media, if you look at his pathway, he is a true student of a possession-based game, but that's just not as easy as showing up and doing 4v4 plus 3 and using all the terminology in the world to try and get those tactics across. No, the first things first is teaching or facilitating. He was very careful with his language. He stepped away from teaching, stepped away from the word coaching, and you can see he's more of a facilitator. How those players learn or develop the habit of working, competing, doing all the things that you need that will fuel the desire to learn and the desire to get those points across, both from in games and in training sessions, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant. So for me, the takeaway, if I was taking a U12 team in for pre-season or a U10 team for pre-season, that yes, we want to get to that type of football, yes, we want to implement it, but at the same time, the basics and the foundation of that system is different from what Pep Guardiola goes in on YouTube and you see what he has to work with, and there are some gimmies there. That gimme is the passion, that gimme is the competition level. And I think now when we're in coaching at the youth levels, that these things that used to be almost given in society, that were the ability to compete, the ability to go through adversity, I think now we have to start being a little bit more intentional about delivering those in our environments, in a safe way, of course. But the game can do that. As David said, the game is going to have a winner and a loser, and making training competitive and making young players aware of the challenges of it every day, I think was brilliant. So, really, really enjoyed that. Like I said, I don't work in youth football, but I'm always fascinated to see what's coming through, what ideas are being implemented, how we're improving the experience for young players. So for coaches who are working at that level, please let me know what you thought. Let me know other aspects that we could talk about on the podcast, other people that we could get on who can add value to the conversation, for sure. So always, we'd love to hear your thoughts at Gary Curneen on Instagram, at Gary Curneen on Twitter. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I will see you very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Soccer Coach Podcast. For more coaching topics, sessions, and resources, head on over to Coach Curneen on Facebook or visit the website at www.modernsoccercoach.com.